Miss Messenger called me one day and said, get up to Sunset Boulevard in this office of producer Gene Rodney. They're doing a show called Father Knows Best from the radio show that's going to star Robert Young.
Elinor Donahue reveals why Father Knows Best was canceled. A truth she kept to herself for decades. For 6 seasons, she was Betty Anderson. But few people know that before she ever won that role, she was rejected to her face and left crying on a stage, certain she had thrown away her one big chance. And the heartbreak did not end there. The show was taken from her against her will, and the opportunity that came next, the one that should have made her bigger than ever, collapsed in a way nobody saw coming. Now, Elinor Donahue finally reveals the truth about Father Knows Best.
Just whose side are you on?
I'm on your side if you'll make room for me.
Dinner will be on in a few minutes.
I'm not hungry.
Oh, now, Betty.
Father, please.
All right.
What caused Father Knows Best's cancellation? When Father Knows Best arrived on American television in 1954, almost no one expected it to become a national institution. Based on a successful radio program, it followed the everyday joys and struggles of the Anderson family. Elinor Donahue played Betty Anderson, the oldest daughter, and the warmth the cast brought to the screen turned the show into one of the defining sitcoms of the decade. For 6 seasons, the Andersons felt less like characters and more like the family millions of viewers wished they had. Then, in 1960, at the height of its popularity, it was suddenly gone. To fans, the cancellation made no sense. The ratings were strong and the audience was loyal. A show that wholesome and that successful was not supposed to simply disappear. And for years, people traded theories about feuds, falling ratings, or some hidden disaster. Only much later did Elinor Donahue finally explain what had truly happened. According to Elinor, there was not one single reason. There were 2. The first arrived like a wrecking ball at the very start of 1960, when the Writers Guild of America went on strike. From January through June, the writers who powered Hollywood put down their pens, and that included the writers of Father Knows Best. By that point, the show was producing close to 40 episodes a year. 40. That pace demands a constant supply of fresh scripts. And without writers, there were no scripts. Production ground to a halt, and the series was forced into a sudden hiatus. But here is the part that surprised even Elinor. When the strike ended in June, she assumed everyone would head straight back to work. They did not. The strike had wounded the show, but it was not the thing that actually killed it. 2 of the leads had decided they did not want to come back. Robert Young, who played the patriarch Jim Anderson, and Jane Wyatt, who played his wife Margaret, had both reached the end of the road. After 6 seasons of carrying America's favorite family, they amicably decided it was time to retire. And once the mother and father of the household were gone, there was no household left to film. For Elinor, that decision changed everything. But losing the show was only the beginning of her story, and what came next would bring a quieter heartbreak all its own. Elinor continued acting after the show's cancellation. What made the ending sting even more was how Elinor learned the truth of it. At first, she was told only that Robert Young did not want to return. She did not even realize that Jane Wyatt, the actress who played her on-screen mother, had also been part of the decision to walk away. The 2 had quietly agreed to retire together. Elinor, by contrast, would have happily kept playing Betty Anderson for years. The choice that ended the best role of her life had been made entirely without her. If there was any silver lining, it was that she did not stay unemployed for long. In fact, Elinor made the leap to another hit series the very same year Father Knows Best ended. She was hired onto The Andy Griffith Show, one of the most beloved comedies in television history. to play the town pharmacist and the romantic interest of Andy himself. Think about how rare that is. Most actors who lose a defining role spend months, sometimes years, waiting for the phone to ring again. Many never recover at all. Elinor barely had time to grieve the Andersons before she was handed a seat on a show that would become an American institution in its own right. For a brief moment, it looked like the best possible outcome, as if she had stumbled out of one classic and straight into another without missing a step. After the powerlessness of watching Father Knows Best end without her, it must have felt like proof that her career was still very much alive, that the door had not closed after all, but simply swung open somewhere new. But her time on the Andy Griffith Show did not go nearly as well as anyone expected. And the reason had nothing to do with the writing, the cast, or the producers. It had everything to do with Elinor herself. The very thing that should have been a triumphant second act was about to become one of the most frustrating chapters of her career. And the obstacle standing in her way was not a person or a contract. It was a fear she had carried since childhood. Elinor wasn't a good fit for Andy Griffith. On the Andy Griffith Show, Elinor played Ellie Walker, and the producers did not see her as a short-term character at all. They envisioned keeping her on for the long haul, and there were even plans for Andy's character to eventually marry Ellie. It could have made her a permanent fixture on one of the most enduring shows in American television. And then it slipped through her fingers. The chemistry between Ellie and the rest of the cast never quite clicked, and the reason traced back to something happening inside Elinor herself. For the first time in her entire career, she was being asked to play a grown woman, a romantic adult lead. That may sound simple, but for Elinor, it was terrifying. She had spent her whole life on screen playing children and teenagers, and she had never once played anything else. Every part she had ever known had cast her as a girl, not a woman. Suddenly, stepping into the role of Andy's love interest left her feeling deeply self-conscious, and that discomfort bled into her performance. By her own admission, she could not give the part everything it needed. The situation became uncomfortable enough that Elinor made a remarkable decision. Although she had signed a 3-year contract, she went to the producers and asked to be let out of it after only a single year. They agreed. Her time as Ellie Walker lasted from 1960 to 1961, and the producers eventually found a new love interest for Andy in the form of Helen Crump, played by Annetta Corsott. The role that could have defined the next chapter of Elinor's career instead became a brief footnote, walked away from by the actress herself. Walking away from a guaranteed multi-year contract on a hit show is almost unheard of in an industry where steady work is everything. But Elinor knew she was not giving the part what it deserved, and she would rather step aside than coast through a role she could not feel proud of. It was honest, and it was costly. Even so, she was far from finished. Elinor kept working steadily for decades, appearing on shows as varied as The Odd Couple and even Star Trek, reuniting with her old castmates for a Father Knows Best television movie in the late 1970s, and turning up as late as 2010 on The Young and the Restless, more than 60 years after her career first began. But to understand why losing these early roles cut so deep, and why so much of her later life would be marked by quiet hardship, you have to go back to the very beginning, to a frightened teenager who was already convinced her time in Hollywood was over. Elinor Donahue was about to give up on acting. Here is something almost no one watching Father Knows Best could have guessed. When Elinor Donahue was cast as Betty Anderson, she genuinely believed she was on her way out of acting altogether. It was not arrogance or burnout. It was simple math. Elinor was only 17 when the show began, but she had already been working in the industry for more than a decade. She had gotten her start at just 6 years old back in 1943, when she signed a contract with the legendary studio MGM. As a child, she was placed in a variety of films and found a respectable, if modest, level of success. But that fairy tale had a cruel catch built into it, one that has trapped countless child stars before and since. As Elinor grew up and approached adulthood, the roles started to dry up. The parts that came so naturally to an adorable child were not being written for an awkward teenager caught between childhood and adulthood. The offers shrank, the opportunities faded, and Elinor began to feel that there was no future for her in acting at all. So she made a practical decision. If acting would not have her, she would find another way to perform. Elinor turned to dancing, and she was good at it, finding real success as a chorus girl on the stage. By 1954, the practical side of her was winning. She had been promised a steady gig as a chorus girl at a popular nightclub in Reno, and she was actively planning to move there and begin a new life. To her, it felt final. Reno was not a backup. It was the beginning of the rest of her life, a clean break from a Hollywood that seemed to have quietly closed its doors. And then her manager called. There was an audition, he said, for a new television adaptation of a radio program called Father Knows Best. Elinor got excited, despite herself. A role on that show would not just be another job. It would be a reason to stay in Hollywood, a chance to keep the dream alive instead of packing it away in a suitcase bound for Reno. The problem was that wanting the role and winning it were two entirely different things, and the people in charge of casting were about to make her fight for it harder than she ever imagined. Elinor worked hard to get her Father Knows Best role. When Elinor Donahue first met the producers of Father Knows Best, the meeting did not go the way she hoped. After looking her over, they decided she was simply too plain to play Betty Anderson. For most aspiring actors, that kind of verdict from the people holding the role is the end of the conversation. Elinor refused to accept it. Instead of slinking away defeated, she decided she would change their minds by changing her appearance. She underwent a complete makeover, determined to show them something different. And in one of the great ironies of her career, it backfired in the exact opposite direction. The producers took one look at the made-over Elinor and decided she now looked too much like a flashy, glamorous star. First, she was too plain, and now she was too polished. Either way, the answer was still no. 2 rejections from the same room would have ended most actors' hopes completely. But Elinor had something burning inside her that would not let her quit. She understood that landing this role was the single best move she could make for her future, and that walking away meant surrendering the dream for good. So she simply refused to take no for an answer. She kept pushing until she finally wore the producers down and convinced them to let her do a proper screen test. It was the opening she had fought for, and it turned into a disaster. Elinor was scheduled to test alongside Robert Young, the seasoned actor already cast as the show's patriarch. The pressure overwhelmed her. In the middle of the test, with the cameras rolling and so much riding on every word, she forgot her line. And then, standing there on the stage, the dam broke. She burst into tears in front of everyone, certain she had just destroyed the most important opportunity of her life. What happened next is the reason her story did not end right there. Robert Young, watching this terrified young woman fall apart, felt genuine sympathy for her. Rather than letting the producers send her home, he insisted they give her a moment to calm down and try again. According to the story Elinor has told, Robert handed her a bottle of Coca-Cola and gently told her to take a breather. It was a small act of kindness from a veteran star to a panicking newcomer, and it bought her the one thing she needed most: a second chance. While she pulled herself together, the producers tested another young actress for the part, and even Elinor was not convinced she could win it. Elinor couldn't believe she got the role. When Elinor finally got her second chance to screen test, she gave it everything she had left. But when it was over, she walked out of that studio feeling no better than the first time. In her own mind, she had not done enough to redeem herself, and the nerves had left her convinced she simply was not good enough. So she did what she had to do to protect her own heart. She put the entire experience out of her mind and turned back to the plan already waiting for her: the move to Reno and the steady job as a chorus girl. As far as Elinor was concerned, the Father Knows Best dream was over. And then, just before she could go through with any of it, the phone rang. It was the call she had stopped allowing herself to hope for. Against the two rejections, the tearful screen test, and her own crushing self-doubt, Elinor Donahue had gotten the role. The part of Betty Anderson was hers. The young woman who had been certain her career was finished, who had already mentally packed her bags for Reno, was instead about to become one of the most recognizable daughters in America. She would play Betty for 6 full seasons, growing up on screen in front of a devoted national audience. And that is what makes the way it all ended so bittersweet. Elinor had wanted this role more than almost anything. She had refused to let the producers say no, refused to let her own fear stop her, and refused to settle for the safe life in Reno. She had clawed her way into the Anderson family through sheer determination, surviving 2 rejections and a tearful screen test to get there. So when the show was taken from her years later, not because of anything she did, but because 2 of her castmates were ready to move on, it landed differently than an ordinary cancellation ever could. She had fought harder than anyone to get in, and in the end, she did not get any say in when it was over. The girl who once begged for a chance was given no chance to hold on. The private heartbreaks she rarely discussed. For all the warmth Elinor projected as Betty Anderson, the real life behind that wholesome image held hardships she almost never discussed in public. She was never a scandal-plagued star. There were no tabloid feuds, no public meltdowns, no headlines about bad behavior. Her sorrows were quieter than that, and in some ways harder, because she carried most of them privately, far from the cameras that had documented so much of her life. It began in childhood. Long before Hollywood, Elinor was already working, performing on the radio, and dancing in vaudeville while still a toddler. By the time she was a young child actress, she had reportedly become the principal breadwinner of her family, earning in a single week what her mother made in an entire month. That is an enormous weight to place on a child. She has kept the details of her parents largely private, but she has spoken of a difficult upbringing, and she would later describe her second husband as the father figure she felt she never truly had growing up. That hard beginning may help explain the relentless self-criticism that shadowed her even at the height of her fame. Elinor was so hard on herself as a young actress that she could not bring herself to watch Father Knows Best when it aired. The same crippling self-doubt is what undid her on The Andy Griffith Show, where she said she felt like a bird pushed out of the nest before it had grown all its feathers. The girl America saw as confident and poised was often, privately, convinced she was simply not good enough. Then there was love and loss. The very show that made her famous also gave Elinor her first marriage. She met a sound man named Richard Smith on the set of Father Knows Best and married him in 1955. But the marriage did not survive. The couple divorced in 1961, and Elinor stepped away from her career to put her personal life back together, now raising a young son in the wreckage of a relationship that had not lasted. Her happiest chapter came next, and so, in time, did her deepest loss. In 1962, she married the television producer Harry Ackerman, a man 24 years her senior, who finally gave her the stability and devotion she had never known. They had 3 sons together, and he embraced her first child as his own. For nearly 3 decades, he was her anchor. Then, in February 1991, Harry died of pulmonary failure at the age of 78. After 29 years of marriage, Elinor lost not only her husband, but the father figure she had spent a lifetime searching for. It was the kind of private grief no script could ever prepare her for, endured quietly, away from the spotlight that had shaped so much of who she was. The truth she finally told. For decades, fans never stopped wondering how a show that beloved could simply vanish at its peak. The answer, as Elinor finally revealed, was both simpler and more human than the rumors. There was no scandal and no behind-the-scenes war. There was a crippling writers' strike that froze production for half a year, and 2 beloved stars who quietly decided it was time to retire. Just bad timing and a personal choice made by the people at the very center of it all. For an audience that had imagined every kind of dramatic explanation, the real story was almost disarmingly ordinary. The simple truth that even the happiest television families eventually decide they are ready to go home. What gives her account its weight is that she never wanted any of it to end. She had been the one fighting to get in, the teenager who refused to give up, and she was left on the outside of the decision that closed it all down. And yet she tells the story without a trace of bitterness. The same woman who quietly endured a hard childhood, a broken first marriage, and the loss of the husband who anchored her for nearly 30 years, still looks back on her career with warmth, remembering Robert Young's kindness with that bottle of Coca-Cola and the role she fought so hard to win. So now, we want to hear from you. Were you surprised to learn the real reason Father Knows Best came to an end? And do you think Elinor's career would have looked completely different if she had stayed on The Andy Griffith Show and become Andy's wife? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy